Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope that you're having a very good weekend. And let's say hi to Jay Cobley. How are you, Jay?
Hello, Mark. Doing great. Good to see you.
Good. Nice to see you too. Welcome. So, this month, we're going to be looking at healing the wounds of legacy, the inherited grievances, narratives, and losses that we carry with us, or which become so much a part of our identity. We're also exploring what happens to those wounds when we enlarge our sense of self to include not only our biological legacy, but the truth of our spiritual nature as well, and connection to the one mind we share with everything that exists. This unity self includes not only our family of origin, but also what is transcendent and not limited by biography. This reminds me of a story about Ram Dass, who was once asked if he identified as Jewish, and he replied, "Only on my parents' side." Acknowledging that we are more than our body minds, more than physical specimens whose existence begins and ends with DNA, shifts our relationship to family as well as our emotional inheritance. It makes it possible to feel compassion for what has happened to us without mistaking ourselves for victims. Instead, we're aware that what exists at our core, the essential self, was never wounded and remains forever whole despite the slings and the arrows of being alive. This essential nature can be seen as awakened attention. Even though in the course of our daily lives we get distracted by our problems and we stop paying attention to this awareness, the attention itself is always there when we choose to return to it. This awareness, this awakened attention, is none other than the witness, the transcendent self that's beyond pain and suffering. This witness helps us to survive our own lives. This first and best part of ourselves reminds us that no matter what happens to us in life, we are whole, we are healed, and we are already free. We're also loved and blessed. And though the human journey can be a rocky one, it's also an experience that is precious beyond measure. To be alive in these complex, miraculous bodies of ours, with minds that are capable of imagination, to know ourselves as both flesh and spirit, aware of our own divine potential, is the greatest mystery and the greatest privilege. Now, it's the awareness of this privilege of being human that transforms our identity, including our relationship to family. It makes our relationships to our biological kin more intimate and profound, in fact. This is the great paradox, because the more grounded we are in transpersonal awareness, the more personal and harmonious our relationships become. When you're no longer a prisoner of your own story, you're able to feel intimacy and kinship with family without imagining that the ties that bind you encompass the totality of who you are. I learned this in my own life. I came from a family that was torn apart by traumas of many kinds: suicides, addiction, rape, abandonment, poverty, fear, and loss. And this experience laid the groundwork for my own personality. These wounds coalesced to create a worldview that I carried for the first 35 years of my life. It dominated how I lived. It was like a great open sore of longing and grief. When I finally discovered spiritual life, my perspective on this family began to shift. First of all, I grieved in ways that I never had before, for the irreversible losses, for the bad things that had happened. But simultaneously, I came to see that this terrible story did not define me. Today, when I look back on my childhood, I see that there was always a part of me that was aware, awake, seeking answers, keeping my spirit alive, that there was always a witness, in other words. It was this witness that pushed me to begin journaling at a very early age and showed me that no matter how bad things got, my steady awareness was always there when I wrote, taking note of what was happening, standing apart, and weirdly unchanging. This was my observing self. It's the self that we all share, the self whose voice never wavers. the God within, you can call it, that knows the truth and can guide a person when you quiet down enough to listen. Eventually, for me, a minor miracle happened, which enabled me to finally be with my family without severe dread and anxiety. I was able to see them as separate people, as souls that I had mingled with early in life before going off to live as an adult. Today, I love my family with all my heart. I value our connection very, very deeply, but I'm also keenly aware that we're only related on our parents' side. The rest of who I am isn't traceable to a family tree. And this is an important thing for all of us to remember. We need to remind ourselves on a regular basis that the entities we call ourselves have not only a biological footprint, but also a transcendental footprint. We are both transpersonal and personal, both physical and spiritual in origin. The qualities of the divine within us, what you can call the Buddha nature, what some people call soul, aren't earned or conditional. They weren't passed down to us by our parents, and they can't be taken away. This collection of godly attributes is instead the very ground of our being. It's the source of our aliveness, and it's the core of our humanity. This humanity is abundant in all of us, from the poorest of the poor to the most privileged, from the most enlightened, benevolent individuals to people dominated by malice and evil. Because aside from the tiny fraction of the population afflicted with what's known as the dark triangle of mental illness, psychopathy, sociopathy, or clinical narcissism, aside from that very, very small fraction of the population, it's only ignorance that hides the goodness of people from themselves. This essence is consistent and it doesn't waver. It's free of all defilements, loss, and pain. And it's also on the path of awakening our ace in the hole, the doorway to freedom. This essence is the solution to the problem of life itself, which can otherwise feel like a terrible joke or just a bad nightmare. Now, the vast majority of people on the planet are unfortunately unaware that this essence exists. And that helps to explain rising levels of anxiety, depression, addiction, suicide, and violence. I was working recently with a very intelligent man in his 50s whose life had become a kind of nightmare to him. Following a traumatic experience in which his wife and his son were lost to addiction, he came to the conclusion that spirituality was a bunch of nonsense and that the world was, in his words, a real shithole. He believed that any god who'd create such a system was a sadistic deity and he wanted no part of it. He imagined that nature itself is evil because she survives, as he put it, through destruction, dog eating dog, and that he himself was somehow a butt of some sickening, senseless joke. This fellow had no understanding of being bigger than his story. His family tragedy had come to completely define who he was. Angry, bitter, disappointed. He'd lost any sense of a higher power and was projecting his grief onto the cosmos. Now, the jury is still out at the moment over whether he will wake up from his depression and his delusion. He has tremendous resistance to releasing his anger and his grief, but I do hope that this changes over time. In truth, though, it points to how most people live their lives, as if they were foundlings dropped into human families, unaware of their higher dimension. Because in a materialist culture like ours, we're not taught about our spiritual essence as children, nor are we encouraged to seek it out. Ask 100 random people to tell you who they are, and you'll hear all about their life circumstances, their nationality, their physical attributes, their family systems, their likes, their dislikes, and the experiences that have shaped their lives. But it's unlikely that you will hear a single one describe herself as a child of God. And if she does, you might be tempted to write her off as some kind of a religious fanatic. This prejudice against claiming our spiritual identity has truly catastrophic impacts, not only on society at large, but within families themselves. You may remember the famous passage from Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet. Your children are not your children. They're the sons and the daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, they belong not to you. In other words, we are the offspring of spirit. We're delivered into this world by parents who were also born from this same mysterious source. But let me be clear, this isn't a form of spiritual bypassing. I'm not suggesting that we just leapfrog our pain. Focusing on the transcendent dimension as the foundation of your identity doesn't deny family wounds or inherited trauma in any way. We're not encouraged to reject our emotional damage or downplay the after effects of dysfunctional parenting. Instead, we're simply asked to remember that spirit exists always in the here and now. Spirit is always present, and so is the truth-telling witness. The witness knows that it's more than a product of the past. It can recall the past when necessary, but it doesn't drag it around behind it like a bag of dirty laundry. Instead, the witness recognizes that thoughts are thoughts and not the truth. Though real for a moment, they're gone the next. The witness understands, too, that memories are thoughts, and that certain memories connected to extreme emotions may manifest in the body and become lodged there as symptoms. But the vast majority of thoughts are fleeting and leave no trace whatsoever. What were you thinking about 5 minutes ago? Where are those thoughts now? They're non-existent. Not a trace of them exists in the universe except within the confines of your memory, and soon enough that will be gone as well. Spiritual life teaches us that the wounded identity is composed primarily of memory. The idea of me and mine, this identity, is retrospective. Without the past, this little self, as we know it, loses its foothold. This suggests, in turn, that present moment awareness may be the best medicine available to us for healing the poisons of family trauma. Each time you feel yourself being pulled back into the tangle of family or early wounding, take a breath and pause and bring yourself into witness awareness. Recognize that it's a story pulling you back. It's a memory within your imagination, and gently bring yourself back to the present. Ground yourself in your environment. Pay attention to the details of where you are and what's actually happening. If possible, explore your thoughts and feelings on paper or in dialogue with someone else. Ask yourself, what is the allure of this memory? What is my attraction to pain from the past? Why do I feed off it at times like a vulture picking at a dead body? What do I fear losing if I forget or cease retelling these sad old stories again and again and again ad infinitum? You may come to realize that overfixation on the past is a way of trying not to die. It's a way of holding on to what you had, to people, places, and things you associate with your identity, even when those things were destructive and painful. You'll see that this isn't a reason to judge yourself. There's nothing more common than dwelling on the past and believing that blood is thicker than water. But we also realize that it requires vigilance and hard effort to break out of this way of thinking, particularly within a culture whose messages contradict the very awakening that I'm talking about. But of course, that's what being a seeker is. Seekers are people who want to find out who we actually are, to tell the truth about our essential nature and what's possible in the human experience. Seekers want to transcend fantasy and sentimentality in order to connect to the source of being and the knowledge that we are already free. When this happens, we're no longer faithful to our heartbreak, loyal to our grief, or stuck in the sadness of our cumulative losses. Instead, we are tired of unnecessary suffering. We're outraged by the degree of our brainwashing, and we are truly filled with a longing for aliveness and joy, and very happy to leave the past behind. So ask yourself, how do you create unnecessary suffering when it comes to your family? Either the present day family or memories of childhood. Do you blame early wounding for present problems? And if so, how effective is this strategy? What happens when you view your family members as souls sharing a constellation, the maker of which is God? How does that heal the wounds of legacy? These are worthwhile questions to explore. So that's what I wanted to say to you about healing the wounds of family legacy. Jay, why don't we pull up the card and we'll do a bit of writing? I'd like you please now to take 15 minutes to write about viewing family wounds through the eye of the witness and how that changes your relationship to those wounds. If it does, how and why does it change them? And if it doesn't, why not? Be as specific as you can be, please. We will take 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back together as a group.